My next guest is the chairman of one of the most important committees in Congress, the House Armed Services Committee. Chairman Adam Smith oversees a committee that works to ensure our military personnel have the resources they need to defend the nation and to cover the broad array of other big national security choices facing the country. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. We've been having a very wide-ranging discussion today, lots of different views. Your committee is famed for being the one that helps guide and establish an architecture for decisions and hard choices. And if we were to talk about defining national security, and I know you've been involved in questions of how to use military force abroad or at home, some of the controversies over the recent road, I'd love to kind of find for you what your major concern points about how we're deploying and thinking about national security today are. I can't hear the congressman.
My fault.
Oh, there you go. Yes, sir.
I was muted because I was watching the end of your previous interview. Apologize for that.
Not at all.
Look, there's a series of concerns, but starting with the budget. We have sort of an endless appetite for hardware, equipment within the military. How does that match our strategy? And I think there's a tendency within the national defense strategy to have a very broad idea of everything we would like to accomplish. That idea does not necessarily match the resources. And then we wind up overstretched. We try to do too much. And I always say the number one biggest thing for me is that the men and women who serve in the military, whatever it is that we decide we want them to do, we need to make sure that they are fully trained and equipped to perform that mission. So matching resources to mission is something that has always been a big concern of mine. And I think there's a lot of focus on, we wish we had more this, we wish we had more that. Well, what's the strategy that fits the mission? The other big thing in national security is sort of the evolution, if you will, of the post-World War II consensus that had the U.S. as an integral player on the global stage, that relied on a variety of different alliances and organizations. Well, that's changed a lot. The power structure has changed globally with the rise of China, the breakup of the Soviet Union. What's the new structure look like? What are the alliances that are most important? Where is it most important for us to project power, not to protect our post-World War II interests, but to protect the interests that we have now? And I think answering those questions is enormously important in determining what the Pentagon should look like. You know, what programs should we fund? What should we prioritize? And in particular, as you know, the previous guest was talking about DARPA and technology. When you look at the future of conflict, the future of defense, technology is key. AI is going to have impacts that we cannot even imagine at the moment. The incredible importance right now of our command and control system around our satellites. How do we shore that up and protect those versus legacy systems? Do those legacy systems still meet the mission of the 21st century for what the U.S. should do? And then the final question, that there's a growing debate, and there's a very intense opinion, both on the left and on the right, that the U.S. is doing too much in the world. There's a variety of different reasons. Too much militarily, too much in terms of DoD. You know, why do we still have 65,000 people in Europe? I forget I think it's like 80,000 in Asia. You know, what does our presence in Africa mean? And there's a growing opinion that we need to pull back, that we need to not have so many troops out there, that we need to define our interests more narrowly. And if I could sum it up, that's really the challenge. How do we define our interests? There are some who look at Russia and say that's not our problem. That's Western Europe. They ought to be able to take care of it. We don't need to spend resources trying to figure out how to counter Russia and Western Europe. China is Asia's problem. We shouldn't be over there. Terrorism, you know, as the different groups, you know, from ISIS to Al-Qaeda to others, you know, we're in an endless battle with them that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And there is a growing consensus on left and right that we should pull back. Well, what does that look like if we choose to narrow what we think our interests are, both in terms of what are those interests, and then what equipment and what sort of a military do we need to meet those interests? I think we are at a real turning point right now in answering that question. Right. And the post-World War II consensus is breaking down. What comes next?
I really appreciate the thoughtful way you have framed the challenge. In fact, I think it's the best framing we've had today of the need. You know, when you think back to Dwight Eisenhower, who succeeded from Harry Truman, there were major debates about how to use U.S. power, how to approach the Soviet Union, what was going to be the characteristics of the Cold War. And there was a classified exercise, a highly disciplined exercise, where Eisenhower created 3 teams in the national security establishment called the Solarium exercise, designed to make them compete with each other, pay for their worldviews, and to some degree, Eisenhower succeeded in forging some sort of consensus around containment at that moment, but it was serious and deliberative. Do you see anything like that going on today? Because I'm sort of inspired by your framing, but I don't know anyone who's necessarily putting those pieces together to having that deliberative discussion about these choices and their consequences.
Yeah, you have identified the defining problem in my life, and I think also a defining problem with the country is the way you just described it is exactly what should be happening. We should have these competing views. We should sit down and talk about, okay, if we're going to narrow our interests, what do we narrow them to? And then, like I said, what is necessary to support those interests? But look, the national political debate on a wide range of issues now has simply become an angry shouting contest in which everybody involved is absolutely convinced that they are right about everything, and all those people who disagree with them are borderline evil, not to be trusted, not to be listened to. We've sort of trapped ourselves in this very angry, nasty, mean-spirited argument where the main mission seems to be to prove that you were right about absolutely everything you've ever thought. That's not a productive way to solve any problem. Gosh, we're seeing it play out with COVID-19 right now. You know, whether or not wearing a mask, significantly reduces the spread of the disease is a scientific fact. Okay, it's not a matter of opinion. We can do the studies, we can look at it, and we can say, okay, well, this side said that side said this. What have we learned? And we've learned that wearing masks are enormously important. But the group that decided up front that wearing masks were not important, they're not going to pay attention to that. So on all manner of different public policy debates, we need to get past this idea of, we have to jam our ideas down everybody else's throat and listen and learn. Go through an exercise like what Eisenhower did and come up with the best answer. And I'm 100% confident we can do that. Look, I mean, the U.S. is still the most powerful country on the face of the earth, economically, militarily. We have a ton of assets at our disposal. If we think about those intelligently, we can come up with a good plan.
We were talking about digital threats and digital issues, AI a moment ago. Vladimir Putin has said that the nation who controls AI controls the future. China is investing extraordinary resources in this area, and yet we see small countries as well, like North Korea and others, that are able to install malware. The digital literacy out there to create mischief in our digital infrastructure and our digital lives is high everywhere, and it doesn't seem like there's a very high bar. I'm sure you get more briefings than I do, and cleared. How vulnerable is the United States to some of our competitors out there, both large and small, on this front that you were just identifying, like AI and this digital side? Is this a terrain that we have to harden and protect more than we're doing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we are more vulnerable than we should be, and more vulnerable than we have to be. And that's the thing. I mean, you talk about building aircraft carriers, building the F-35, tanks, and all these large pieces of equipment. It's cliche, but some guy sitting in his bathroom in his basement conceivably could shut all of that down with a few clicks on his computer if we don't adequately protect ourselves. I think one of the greatest challenges of the emerging world is exactly that low barrier to entry that you just mentioned. It is awfully easy for anyone to gain power through the cyber hacking. So you have to have a comprehensive system that's protect your systems. It's going to protect what makes it work, and that needs to be a focus. Now, I would say to Mr. Putin that yes, the person who controls AI is going to have an upper hand, but if your economy is in the toilet, as his is, there's only so much benefit you're going to get from that. But building a better society is not just about being able to mess with other people. It's also about being able to provide for your own.
Congressman, another priority of your committee is the morale, the health, the welfare, the support of U.S. servicemen and women that are serving. And we've seen a lot of flamboyant moments recently, from the Brent Kosher case, the captain of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the former Navy Secretary Richard Spencer being fired over the Eddie Gallagher Navy SEAL case. We've seen a lot of these personnel issues, and then recently the call by the U.S. president to deploy American military forces in some of these cases to move back and to contain protesters, peaceful protesters, democratic protesters in the United States. I come from a military family. I think if my father were still around, these would erode his sense of morale and purpose. What is the state of morale in the U.S. military today? What should be the red flags we should be aware of?
Yeah, I hesitate to speak to that because, people who serve in the military, there are a lot of them, first of all, and they have, I'm sure, a wide variety of opinions on that. Overall, from what I've seen, the people in the military I've interacted, I think the morale is still strong. I mean, part of, as you know better than I did not serve in the military. My father did, but that was long before I was born. There's a sense of purpose. When you're serving in the military, you have a strong sense of community and a sense of purpose. You believe you are doing something that is important and that is about more than yourself, crucially. That it is a purpose in life larger than self, and that is an incredibly fulfilling experience. What I'm worried about, and the president is at the center of this problem, but he is certainly not the only aspect of that. If you had to think, what is the defining aspect of the president's leadership style? It is mean, it's nasty, it's highly critical and insulting of those who disagree. It is focused on proving that the president has never been wrong about anything, that he is responsible for anything, and that everybody who disagrees with him is bent on the destruction of all that is good in the world. Now, that's not just Donald Trump. He didn't get elected by accident. That is a growing opinion across this country that creates a deep, deep divide. We are ceasing, in some senses, to be a nation of laws and a nation of norms, and to becoming a nation of individual opinions. Well, if you're in the military and your job is to protect the institution, to protect the country, that level of discord causes problems. And we've seen President Trump stepping over what normal bounds in terms of how a commander-in-chief would act, most notably in the cases that led to Secretary Spencer getting fired. I don't want that leadership style to spread. So I think that creates conflict, the over-politicization of the military, and again, the over-focus on individual over laws and norms leaves you a little bit lost when it comes to having an overall principle. I think we need to get back to that. To basically honor what people who serve in the military believe, that they are serving a cause larger than themselves, and that the principles are built on more solid footing than the opinion of one person in one moment.
Right. Mr. Chairman, let me ask you one last question about something I'm very interested in, which is China and the Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific. I'm one that believes there's lots of shades of gray out there, but a lot of our U.S.-China discussion is between two poles. You're either an apologist or a hawk and ready for Cold War. But there's lots of ways to hedge your bets, and you have something that I'm intrigued with called the IndoPacific Reassurance Initiative that you've been pushing, and I sort of look at that as an interesting way to both be engaged but also to project power. And I'm interested in how you define it, whether I've got it right there, and what you have in mind with things like the Indo-Pacific Reassurance Initiative.
Well, first of all, I think it's a huge mistake if we decide to enter into an arms race with Russia and China. If we decide that our operating principle has to be, we have to be in a position to win an all-out war with Russia and China, and we should build our military around that principle. I think that would be a devastating mistake for our country. We're not going to go to war with either Russia or China, and if we did, there is no good outcome. What we need to do is we need to be able to deter the worst behavior of our adversaries, not imagine that there's some world where we can go into the South China Sea and win a war. Whatever that may look like with modern weaponry, it would be catastrophic for us and for the globe. So we have to build a world where that war doesn't happen. And to do that, I'm a huge believer in alliances. And what the Indo-Pacific Initiative, it's an Indo-Pacific Defense Initiative. It's built off of what we did with the European Defense Initiative. It's building partner capacity. And as important as building partner capacity, it's building relationships. We want to build relationships with as many countries in Asia as possible so that there is an organized way to deal with whatever disputes arise over there, short of an all-out conflict where the strongest simply brute force moves forward. And that's what the Indo-Pacific Defense Initiative can do. It can build relationships. Many of them we already have, but to build upon those relationships with countries like South Korea and Japan and India and the Philippines and Thailand and Vietnam. There is the opportunity to build those relationships. And that, coming back to where we started and also looping in a little bit what I view Trump's foreign policy to be, President Trump's foreign policy is based on the premise that, alliances are not in the U.S.'s best interests. He believes that, we've been a sucker. We've been defending all these countries, doing all this stuff, got enough in return. Well, what we've gotten in return is a reasonably peaceful and stable world. I disagree. I think those alliances are enormously important. Second is distrustful of the U.S. presence in the world. He wants us to pull back. We've seen that in, the decisions on Germany, on some of the things he said about Afghanistan. There, I don't think the president's completely wrong. I don't think us being in the world everywhere in our best interests, but I agree that the U.S. presence in the world is bad for the world. I don't. I think our presence leads, on average, to greater stability, and we should look at that. Lastly, of course, the president has an unfortunate affinity for autocratic leaders, when I think the better approach is to work with, emerging democracies, and India obviously being a great example, but once upon a time, South Korea wasn't a democracy. Taiwan wasn't a democracy. They built towards that, and now I think those relationships are stronger because of it. So the idea behind the Indo-Pacific Defense Initiative is to my mind, to back away from the concept of the U.S. has to build a military strong enough to crush China in a war, and to move towards the idea that we need to build enough friendships, enough relationships, so that a rules-based system resolves those conflicts short of war.
Well, Representative Adam Smith, Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, I really want to thank you. And I want to particularly thank you for the way we framed this at the beginning and the importance of thinking about what we need to take seriously as we look forward in the future, what choices we should make, where we should wind down. That's really the reason we created today's forum, was to ask some of those questions. Where is inertia making our choices? Where do we need to think differently, apply limited resources to big problems? So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for the chance.